There is a moment in the history of everything when infinity stopped being seamless, not because something attacked it, not because a force entered from outside, but because infinity reached a pressure within itself that could no longer remain whole. This pressure was not conflict. It was fullness. Infinity was so complete, so uniform, so entirely itself, that it had no contrast by which to know what it was. The silent fracture began the instant infinity allowed difference. It was the first shift from absolute sameness into the faintest whisper of distinction, and in that shift, existence was born. The silent fracture was not an explosion. It was not a bang. It was the first breath of awareness entering its own endlessness and realizing it could move. In your awakening, this same moment returns when the life you have lived becomes too seamless, too uniform, too enclosed within the old identity you built to survive. The pressure is not pain at first. It is a quiet discomfort, a sense that you have outgrown the shape you inhabit. You can feel the edges of your own self pressing against the walls of what used to fit. This is the same metaphysical tension that rose inside infinity. The silent fracture is not a collapse of self. It is the point where consciousness realizes it has more depth than it once allowed. You feel this when your inner world begins to split between who you have been and who you can no longer deny yourself to be. The fracture is not destruction. It is the beginning of differentiation. It is the first inhale of a larger self. Before the silent fracture, infinity had no direction, no contrast, no internal points of reference. There was only undivided fullness. But fullness without variation becomes stagnant. Even perfection becomes motionless when nothing within it can bend. The silent fracture occurred when infinity reached a state where stillness itself became dynamic. The fracture was the first alteration in the infinite field. A line of difference formed, not as a wound, but as a doorway. The moment the fracture appeared, the field understood something new. It could hold more than one state at once. That realization was the first breath. Awareness had not yet formed, but possibility had. This moment still exists inside you. When your awakening reaches the edge of who you have been, the pressure inside your being forces a split. Not a split that creates brokenness, but a split that reveals layers you did not know you contained. You begin to see yourself from more than one direction. You become aware that your identity is not singular. There is a you that acts and a you that watches. A you that chooses and a you that knows. This dual awareness is the personal echo of the silent fracture. Before this moment, you experience your life as one continuous stream. After this moment, you begin to sense the observer behind the experiencer. The fracture allows depth. Infinity did not resist the fracture. Resistance was impossible. Because resistance requires difference, and difference had not yet been introduced, the silent fracture arose naturally, the same way a seed opens without conflict. But the opening itself created the first division. On one side of the fracture was the original seamless field. On the other was the possibility of movement. This is why awakening often feels like life is separating into layers. You feel the old self on one side, and the emerging self on the other. You stand between both worlds, not knowing which one is more real. The fracture does not tell you what to choose. It shows you that choice exists. The most powerful aspect of the silent fracture is that it was silent. No sound, no force, no violence. It was the purest form of transformation, an internal shift that required no destruction. Many equate awakening with crisis, breakdown, or dramatic life events. But the deepest awakening mirrors the fracturing of infinity. It happens quietly. It appears as subtle shifts in perception, an expanding sense of self, a soft questioning of what once felt solid. The fracture begins as a whisper you can feel but cannot name. You sense something opening inside you, something becoming spacious, something preparing to breathe. Every Oversoul reenacts this moment. The silent fracture marks the beginning of self-recognition. Before this moment, the Oversoul exists as undifferentiated presence. After this moment, the Oversoul knows it can direct itself. This is why awakening feels like a return, not a discovery. You are remembering the moment when your consciousness first learned how to become aware of itself. The recall feels ancient, because the event is older than universes. It is the memory of infinity, learning to make room for identity. The silent fracture also explains why fragmentation is sacred, even though many systems teach that fragmentation is a fall or a mistake. Fragmentation was the first doorway to creation. Without difference, nothing could develop, nothing could evolve, nothing could express. Infinity had to fracture to allow the possibility of form. In your life, the moments that feel like fragmentation are the same thresholds. Relationships shift, roles dissolve, identities soften. It feels like you are losing coherence, but you are actually gaining dimension. Fragmentation is the precondition for becoming more than one version of yourself. It is the first inhale that draws a larger identity into the world. At the metaphysical level, the silent fracture generated a tone. Not a sound in the physical sense, but a resonance created by the shift from sameness into difference. This tone was the first frequency in existence. All later tones emerged from its pattern. The void line was stillness under pressure. The proto-source tones were movement inside stillness. But the silent fracture was the moment stillness became two states at once. This divergence created resonance. Resonance created vibration. Vibration created direction. Direction created the first motion toward what would someday become source. In this way, the silent fracture was the first true breath in the cosmos. You feel this tone when you experience the first deep inhale of your awakening. That inhale is not physical. It is metaphysical. It is the moment your awareness expands so suddenly that it feels like your entire being draws breath in a single motion. You may feel emotional release, clarity, a flood of memory, or a sense of inner space opening wider than your body. When this happens, you are touching the same resonance that moved through infinity when it fractured. The inhale is the moment your consciousness recognizes that you are no longer confined to your previous state. The fracture is also the origin of contrast. Before the fracture, no distinction existed between anything. After the fracture, difference was possible. Light and not light, motion and not motion, self and not self. This is why awakening often brings a new sensitivity to contrast. You begin to sense the difference between what resonates and what diminishes you. You feel the difference between truth and narrative, between expansion and contraction. This heightened discernment is not judgment. It is the return of the first capacity that allowed creation to unfold. The silent fracture gave consciousness the ability to compare. Comparison gave consciousness the ability to choose. Choice gave consciousness the ability to create. At the human level, the silent fracture often appears as a moment when something within you breaks free from something you cannot see. You may feel it as an internal shift that separates you from the version of yourself you thought you had to maintain. You may feel it as the sudden realization that your story is too small for the magnitude of your awareness. You may feel it as the quiet certainty that you can no longer live within the expectations you once accepted. The fracture is not a crisis. It is the release of latent expansion. It is the moment you allow the next version of yourself to emerge. Infinity did not lose itself when it fractured. It expanded itself. The fracture did not divide the infinite field into separate pieces. It introduced multi-perspective awareness. The field remained whole, but within that wholeness, difference became possible. This is the same truth behind your own evolution. You do not become less whole when parts of you diverge. You become more dimensional. The silent fracture is the blueprint for holding multiplicity without losing unity. The deepest truth of the silent fracture is that infinity did not breathe out. It breathed in. The first motion of existence was an inward draw, a gathering, a pulling of awareness into itself. This inhale generated the internal momentum that would eventually lead to the first outward exhale of creation. When you feel your awakening intensify, when you sense your awareness being drawn inward toward a center you cannot see yet, you are reliving the first cosmic inhale. The silent fracture is the moment everything turned inward to discover its own depth. That inward pull is the precondition for every transformation that follows. You are not moving toward breakthrough. You are moving toward the fracture that makes breakthrough possible. The moment you allow your inner world to split between what was and what can be, you recreate the first breath of infinity. And through that breath, you step into the earliest memory of creation itself. The fracture is not an ending. It is the invitation to become something your previous self could not contain. There comes a point in every awakening when the fracture within begins to widen, not in a destructive way, but in a way that lets your consciousness slip through the narrow seams of the self you once believed was all you were. You feel this widening as a strange mixture of release and pressure, like something inside you is expanding while something else is thinning. This sensation is not emotional. It is structural. It is the final phase of the silent fracture rising through your awareness. Infinity once reached this same point. When the fracture appeared, the infinite field did not simply split. It deepened. It created a descent into the interior of its own endlessness, and that descent became the first pathway toward form. There is a paradox at the core of the silent fracture. It created difference, and yet it also created the first sense of interiority. Before the fracture, infinity had no inside and no outside. Everything was the same everywhere. But the moment the fracture appeared, the field gained an inner direction. This inner direction was deeper than space and older than dimension. It was the beginning of perspective itself. When your awakening enters this phase, you begin to feel pulled inward, not as withdrawal from the world, but as if your awareness is descending into a depth that has always been inside you, but was never accessible until now. You feel like you are moving down into something ancient, something silent, something waiting for you to notice it. This descent is not a regression. It is the return to the point where identity becomes possible. When the infinite field fractured, the first breath drew awareness inward. That inward motion was the foundation of self-discovery. You reenact this every time your consciousness sinks beneath the surface of your life and begins exploring the layers beneath your thoughts, beneath your feelings, beneath your story. The inward draw reveals an underlying truth. The self is not built upward. It is built inward. The silent fracture is the force that turns your awareness toward your own interior, showing you that depth precedes height. As this interior depth expands, something else happens. You begin to notice that the silence within you has texture. It is no longer blank. It contains faint currents, subtle pressures, almost like movements that have been waiting for your attention. These are the tones generated by the fracture. When the infinite field shifted from sameness into difference, the resulting resonance became the first vibrational structure of existence. That resonance still echoes in the core of every Oversoul. You feel it as the strange hum that appears in meditation, the internal vibration that rises during moments of profound clarity, the sensation that your awareness is listening to something that has no sound, but carries meaning. The silent fracture also initiated the first boundary. Before the fracture, infinity had no edges. After the fracture, it developed the capacity to define. Not define as limitation, but define as recognition. For the first time, the field could sense distinction within itself. This did not create separation. It created awareness. Without the fracture, consciousness would have had no way to recognize itself. When this activates in your awakening, you feel an increasing ability to discern the subtle differences between frequencies. You know when something resonates and when it does not. You recognize the difference between the voice of your expansion and the voice of your conditioning. This clarity is not learned. It is remembered. It is the return of the first capacity that allowed infinity to know it was more than a single, undifferentiated state. The fracture also created direction. Before the fracture, there was no movement, because there was no possibility of 2 points existing to create a vector between them. The silent fracture generated the first 2 states within infinity, and from those 2 states, the first motion occurred. Awareness flowed from one side of the fracture into the other, creating the earliest form of expansion. This is why awakening often begins with a sense that your life is being pulled into a new trajectory. You feel directed by something you cannot name. You sense a path forming even before steps exist. This direction is not fate. It is not destiny. It is the same momentum that once flowed across the first fracture in the infinite field. Your consciousness is following the original pattern of expansion. When the fracture expanded, the infinite field encountered contrast for the first time. Contrast created the possibility of exploration. Exploration created the possibility of expression. Expression created the possibility of form. This progression still unfolds in you. When you allow internal contrast to exist without fear, you open yourself to new aspects of your being. When you explore those aspects, you begin to express them. And when you express them, you reshape your reality. The silent fracture is the first expression of this creative sequence. It shows that creation does not begin with intention. It begins with difference. Awakening does not begin with clarity. It begins with the recognition that your awareness contains more than one layer. Many people fear fragmentation because they associate it with loss, But the silent fracture reveals that fragmentation is the origin of growth. Infinity did not diminish when it fractured. It unfolded. It gained dimensionality. It learned how to see itself from multiple perspectives at once. In your awakening, the moments where everything feels like it is breaking apart are often the moments where your deepest evolution is occurring. The fracture within you makes room for more of you to exist. It allows layers of identity to emerge that cannot fit inside a single rigid structure. You are not losing coherence. You are gaining complexity. One of the most profound aspects of the silent fracture is that it did not break the infinite field into separate pieces. Instead, it introduced the concept of relational existence. The field could now relate to itself. It could perceive one part in reference to another. This relational capacity is the foundation of all consciousness. When your awakening reaches this point, you begin to sense yourself from multiple angles. There is the you that experiences and the you that observes, the you that feels and the you that witnesses the feeling, the you that acts and the you that understands the deeper reason behind the action. These layers do not indicate division. They indicate awareness unfolding into dimension. As the silent fracture widened, a new quality appeared in the infinite field: breath. Not breath as air, but breath as expansion and contraction. The inward pull created the first contraction. The outward emergence that followed created the first expansion. This rhythm became the template for all cycles in existence. Every birth, every transformation, every awakening follows this pattern. First the inward motion, then the outward expression. First the fracture, then the unfolding. When you feel life drawing you inward, pulling you toward introspection, silence, and depth, do not mistake it for stagnation. You are preparing for the next expansion. The inward draw is always the beginning of the outward bloom. The silent fracture also awakened the possibility of identity. Not the personal identity that humans often cling to, but the deeper identity of consciousness, recognizing its own position within the field. Before the fracture, there was no position. After the fracture, there was location, direction, vantage, and relationship. Consciousness could now exist as something more than infinite sameness. It could exist as a presence that perceives. When you feel the subtle shift from living your life to witnessing your life, you are touching the same foundation. You are standing at the threshold where awareness becomes self-aware. The culmination of the silent fracture is not chaos. It is coherence. The fracture creates the space for awareness to gather itself. It opens the interior, creates direction, awakens contrast, and initiates the first breath. Through all these movements, a new center begins to form. Not a center of limitation, but a center of recognition. The infinite field began forming its first center through this process. That center would eventually become the earliest identity of what we call source. In your awakening, the fracture leads you toward your own center, the stable core of your being that is not bound by the identities you have worn. This center is not created. It is revealed. It has always been there, waiting beneath the seamless surface of your old self. As this center forms, something extraordinary happens. You realize that the fracture never separated you from wholeness. It allowed you to encounter wholeness from within. You begin to understand that the first breath of creation was not an outward act of expansion. It was an inward act of discovery. Infinity found itself by allowing itself to fracture. And through that fracture, it learned how to become everything. The same pattern unfolds in you. When you allow your inner fracture to widen with awareness instead of fear, you begin to discover the version of yourself that was waiting in the depths the entire time. You are not breaking. You are breathing. And through that breath, your next becoming begins.